I'm going to turn, however, to another aspect, which is that, not all rituals and symbols are always the same, in the sense that we really need to contextualize these symbols and see how distinct contexts actually insert themselves through little threads by which rituals themselves get slightly reinscribed or mildly altered. I want to therefore turn to the public spheres in which symbols and rituals are expressed. And I'm going to take three areas and three aspects of the discussion to discuss this, to convey this to you: the public spheres and body symbols. The first is turban debates. So the point I want to make is that how have the key symbols of Sikhism played out across time and space? Now, while scripturally grounded, Sikhism has also emerged from and been responsive to contexts in which it has flourished. Not all contexts have been accepting of Sikhism, nor have they viewed Sikh symbols positively. If the context in which the ritual is performed or the symbol adopted and displayed are different, does the doing of a ritual remain unchanged? Or is there an added edge to the ritual performance that suffuses the sense of and the feeling towards ritual identity and religious belonging? So let me first take up what I'm calling turban debates. In diasporic contexts, but also in India, the turban, as I said earlier, the visible symbol of uncut hair, has become the focus of debates, of contests, of legal conflicts, and of course of some resolutions. Despite the differences amongst the Sikh diaspora, turbans strengthened connections between people as followers of the religion and with ethnic community and ethnic identity and community identity. However, globally, in the UK, in Canada, the US, India, and elsewhere, there have been quite disparate responses to the turban. The omnibus term, turban debates, subsumes some of these different responses. It sort of collapses them. But at the same time, it is important to recognize that there have been some very key turning points in the history of the diaspora turban and in the turban debate. A critical event in this issue of the adoption of the turban as a symbol of belonging was the arrival of a young man, a migrant called Tarsem Singh Sandhu, to the Midlands in the UK when he was in his early 20s. Tarsem Singh got a job as a bus driver for the Wolverhampton Transport Committee. But his employers insisted that he had to cut his beard and his head hair because it didn't sync with the uniform body of all bus drivers of the company. He refused to shave or cut either his hair or his beard, arguing that uncut hair was central to the Sikh religious body. He was sacked from his job. His refusal and his dismissal created a furor among Sikh migrants across the globe, certainly in the UK, but across the globe. The frame of piety underlay the defense of the Sikh turban and the beard. The turban went to court in the UK, in Canada, and North America, and landmark legal judgments permitted uncut hair and turbans in uniforms of bus drivers, postmen, the police, and the military. The accommodations and permissions of beard and turban varied, of course, across nations. For example, the Australian military designed special helmets to be worn over turbans which were part of the uniform. Others were more muted in their permissions, insisting that the helmet was a safety regulation that could not be compromised and the turban had to be removed in favor of the helmet. A significant outcome of the turban debates was that the right to display Sikh religious symbols in the public sphere was both insisted on, fought for, and won. So it wasn't just the adoption of an individual expressing their belonging to a faith, but the fact that this faith could be publicly declared. And I think that is a very key aspect of turban debates. However, this did have other consequences. The significance of diaspora turbans and beards intensified in the wake of the 9/11 Islamophobia. All turban wearers were submerged into a homogeneous category, identified as potential terrorists. In August 2012, Sikh devotees outside the Oak Creek, Wisconsin, in the USA, Gurdwara, were shot at and some fatally wounded by a white supremacist who just saw them as Islamic terrorists. Widely condemned, the killing drew attention to the turban as a religious symbol for Sikhs. It also drew attention to the discriminatory practices against turban-donning men. At checkpoints in airports, for example, or on streets, in crossroads, turbans themselves, the turban, became the object of suspicion. It was patted down, swabbed for chemical residues, suspected of being an object that might actually contain explosive devices. Several diaspora Sikh organizations made huge efforts to explain distinctions between styles of turbans worn by followers of different faiths, both to American officials and to the American public at large. Turban primers were published with illustrations of styles of turbans by people, primarily men, of different faith and how they wore their turbans. The agenda to distinguish the Sikh turban from the Islamic was not without its own prejudgments. But I think once again, the turban became a symbol of faith, expressed and displayed in the public sphere. And again, I think the Oak Creek massacres bring the issue of the right to display faith in the public sphere into the center of many debates. Legal judgments were only part of the global response. So, in fact, to overcome scrutiny, Sikhs started to adopt a range of head coverings or styles, indexing the hair, but making the religious body less legible, less readable, less immediately known, enabling Sikh men in particular to cross checkpoints without hindrance. A baseball cap, a very popular style adopted by Sikh men across numerous spaces, from airports to leisure spaces. The baseball cap kept the kesh under wraps. Tying the kesh, on the other hand, in a patka, a very short cloth, tied quite close to the head and keeping the top knot in place. Usually, a patka is worn under the pagadi or the turban. But it can also be worn without the turban. So, tying the kesh in a patka without donning the turban is quite common, and it's spoken of quite frequently as a convenience. Sikh cricket and hockey players frequently tie the patka while playing matches. The other style was the ponytail. The ponytail allowed hair as a mark of religion to disappear. The turban substitutes then differently emphasize the 5 Ks, especially the kesh. The patka covering the top knot pointed to the Sikh ritual body in close imitation of the turban. The ponytail removed any specific indexing of Sikhism altogether, with the baseball cap sort of falling somewhere in between the two. A managed beard, a little cut shaped, could pass through spaces without hindrance, while a man with a full open beard was more closely scrutinized, often stopped at checkpoints. The other was kirpans. So kirpans were also visible symbols, as we saw in the Sikh, Sikh ritualized bodies display the kirpan on their torso. The kirpan, or the symbolic dagger, identified with the warrior status of Khalsa Sikhism, has a more checkered career, negotiating different categories of permission and prohibition. State responses across the globe have been quite uneven because the kirpan has been classified and categorized as a weapon, and therefore has become the object of much stricter regulation. In Canada, where the turban was legally permitted as part of the uniform of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, kirpans were banned, particularly from the legislatures of different assemblies, like in Quebec. The kirpan was banned from the legislature of Quebec, though oddly permitted to be carried into schools if the kirpan was not visible and worn under clothing. In India, the kirpan was viewed as a ritual necessity for Amritdhari or initiated Sikhs, those who had taken the initiation ceremony and become part of the bounded community of Sikhism. And therefore, the kirpan was exempt from provisions and prohibitions under the 1959 Arms Act. Sikhs were permitted to carry the kirpan on domestic flights in India and into courtrooms. Nevertheless, there was intense debate in the Indian Parliament on the question of permitting the kirpan into Parliament House, when a Sikh member of Parliament from Punjab resigned his seat in 1990 because he was prohibited from carrying the kirpan into a parliamentary session. Throughout the 1980s, Sikh men carrying kirpans with open beards, wearing turbans, were frequently apprehended or detained by the Indian police under suspicion of being sympathetic to or outright militant Sikh separatists. So there have been times when the symbolic universe itself has had to negotiate with the context in which the symbols are worn or expressed. I want to now turn to the symbolic universe during times of conflict. I will look at 3 or 4 different areas to discuss how the symbolic universe negotiates conflict or is present or absent during conflict occasions. I'm going to begin with discussing the rituals that I have already spoken of, the langar, kar seva, and the initiation ceremony, the Khande Di Pahul. Through the 1980s, till about the turn of the century, the ethno-national movement for a separate Sikh state of Khalistan and the decades of militancy were a critical turning point for thinking through the symbolic universe and of body symbols, the adoption of body symbols. Though kirpans and uncut hair underline warrior codes, more immediately equated with violence of militancy, there are other collective rituals which emphasized a different tenor of commitment to Sikhism. and which were themselves affected by the violent contexts of militancy. Prominent amongst these other arenas, other rituals, were the langar and seva. During the militant decades, visits to Gurdwara and the performance of rituals like seva, or preparing and eating the langar together, were undertaken as an avowal of faith, positioned against the pervasive opinions that censured Sikhs as innately violent. So sharing a meal or doing manual work of cleaning, swabbing, caring were in fact undertaken as a kind of a response against this condemnation. In the face of censure, the spirit in which seva rituals were enacted altered. Similarly, the langar community was understood both by Sikhs and by non-Sikhs as a restitution of the panth through commensality, through sharing of food. The panth as the bounded, consecrated community. So rituals were no longer just customary or routine performances and enactments. They were in some ways declarative statements of commitment to faith. A similar sense of combative commitment inflected other rituals of identity as well. Before he fled to take sanctuary in the Darbar Sahib in 1982, a very well-known militant leader, Jarnail Singh Bhindranwale, who is very closely identified with the militant movement for a separate state of Khalistan, Bhindranwale toured the Punjab countryside, urging people to recommit themselves to the faith, to undertake collective performances of initiation rituals, and in that performance, proclaim their allegiance to Sikhism. So, of course, the initiation rituals continued at the level of the individual and the family. That was a given. Nevertheless, the wider, more assertive political initiations which were being enacted around Punjab percolated to the level of the ordinary sphere. That collective ritual marked out those who performed the collective initiation ceremony as members of a rebellious community, and that rebelliousness or sense of understanding what was rebelliousness percolated and inflected individual ceremonies with a similar aura, with a similar light. So just undertaking a ritual was no longer a routine affair. The other major event that completely altered the way that Sikhs thought of themselves as belonging to the faith was Operation Bluestar. What was it? It was an Indian Army operation when the Indian Army entered the sacred precincts of the Darbar Sahib to flush out militants who had taken sanctuary within the shrine. Bhindranwale himself had fled and taken sanctuary in the Darbar Sahib. Widely referred, this operation of the Indian Army was widely referred to as Operation Bluestar, conducted in June 1984. The military operation of the Darbar Sahib is remembered as a wound by Sikhs across the world. During and after Operation Bluestar, parts of the shrine complex and some of its key buildings were destroyed by gun battles and fires. The dome of the Akal Takht was partially blown away by tank shells. The government's efforts to repair the dome or to clean and clear the parikrama were met with deep resentment and intense resistance. When the army vacated the complex and it was handed back to the high priests, groups of Sikhs gathered to undertake Kar Seva, to clean the Sarovar, their sacred pool, to repair the damaged parikrama, and to rebuild the dome of the Akal Takht. The rituals of Seva performed to repair and restore their wounded shrine would always remain sharply etched in people's memories. Devotees whom I interviewed in June 2007 recalled viewing the shattered dome of the Takht and weeping to mourn the loss of that precious place. They recalled the intensity of feeling with which they undertook Kar Seva, to clean the water, to wash the walkway, to remove all signs of military occupation and battle. And it's in this that the idea of remembering the past, remembering the sense of belonging, and recreating the feelings for faith through rituals of commemoration, in spaces of commemoration, is an aspect to which I want to, that I would like to discuss. Remembrance is a very important element in Sikh rituals. The Ardas is an exemplar of remembrance, for it remembers martyrs and warriors who died in defense of the faith. As a prayer, therefore, it is based in the idea of remembrance. The Darbar Sahib, as a sacred universe, is replete with memorials of the past. It's a commemorative space in its own way. The shrine of Baba Deep Singh, a celebrated warrior, is a key spot of commemoration within the shrine complex of the Darbar Sahib. Not far from the Darbar Sahib is the Jallianwala Bagh, a garden where devotees who had gathered in 1919, April, was shot by General Dyer in April 1919 for refusing to vacate the garden. All these memorials have been augmented and added to by a newly refurbished Central Sikh Museum within the Darbar Sahib complex, which was refurbished after the restorations were undertaken post June 1984, after the shrine was handed back to the Sikhs. So, visiting Jallianwala Bagh, paying obeisance at Baba Deep Singh's memorial shrine, complemented by a visit to the Central Sikh Museum to view the photographs and paintings of the 1984 army operation and people who had died during the operation, are performative rituals of remembrance. To visit these sites, to visit these spaces, Jallianwala Bagh or Baba Deep Singh's shrine, or indeed the Central Sikh Museum, to visit these shrines on a special set-apart day to remember the destruction of a beloved shrine is a very special ritual in itself. The Remembrance Day or Commemoration Day has been inserted into the ritual calendar of the Darbar Sahib, and it recalls the destruction of the shrine in 1984 and a wounded community. So rituals and symbols embedded in time and space possess a performative charge in and through which Sikhs recommit themselves to their faith. In this figure, on the left-hand side is a group of people very formally dressed in white, the color of mourning, wearing the kesari pug, or the color of the turban that was identified with commitment to faith and distinction, to martyrdom, to military commitment. So all of them visiting the Darbar Sahib in June 2007, many years after 1984, but to commemorate 1984. In the middle slide, you have old Sikh wearing his full, in his full ritual body, ritualized Sikh body, but carrying on his head the mud and the earth which he is going to take to repair the shrine. And on the right-hand side is a portrait of the Akal Takht with part of its dome shattered and the Akal Takht's facade falling. And it is a portrait which is hung in the Central Sikh Museum. It is a portrait which remembers that moment of destruction, that remembers the wound. And though the Akal Takht now is repaired and presents this very serene facade, it is the portrait that remembers. So there is a sense in which, as I said, commemoration and remembrance and repair both are all in their own way rituals of commitment to the faith.